The dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light of the living room were the only things that moved. For a month since the funeral, the house on Oak Street had been caught in a state of suspended animation, holding its breath. For Amelia, it was not just a house, it was an archive, a dense and overwhelming collection of a life she was now tasked with processing. As a museum curator, she was used to handling the artifacts of other people's pasts with careful, reverent hands. But here, every object was a landmine of personal memory. She sat on the floor, a box of her mother's old correspondence open on her lap. Her work at the local history museum was all about piecing together narratives from documents like these. But this felt different. This was not a professional puzzle. It was an open wound. She picked up a small, chipped porcelain bird. She could still hear her mother's voice from a decade ago, a voice not yet clouded by illness. "Your father won this for me at the county fair, the year before Richard was born. He spent $5 on the ring toss. $5! We barely had a penny to our name." Every item held a story, a fragment of the family they had once been, before her father's death years ago, and now her mother's. Sorting through it all was her way of grieving, a quiet, methodical process of saying goodbye. It was a piece that was about to be shattered. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with her brother's name. Richard. She answered with a sense of weary resignation. "Is Sarah with you?" he asked, his voice sharp, dispensing with any greeting. "No, Richard, it's just me at the house." Before she could finish, the phone beeped with another incoming call. Sarah. "For God's sake," Richard barked. "Merge the call, Amelia. I don't have time for this." With a sigh, Amelia tapped the screen, becoming the reluctant switchboard operator for the daily battle. Suddenly, both her older siblings were in her ear, their voices a cacophony of competing grievances. "I have been calling you all morning, Richard." Sarah's voice was a high, theatrical wail. "You can't just make these decisions without me." "I'm making decisions because you're incapable of being rational," Richard shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've spoken to a top real estate agent, Sarah. The market is at an absolute peak. Every single week we wait to list the house, we are actively losing money. It's simple economics." "This isn't about economics, you soulless machine," Sarah cried. "This is our home, our childhood home. I have a deep spiritual connection to this place. I can feel Mom's energy in every room. She would want me to live here, to set up my art studio in the sunroom and create." "Mom would want us to be financially solvent, not to subsidize your pottery hobby," Richard sneered. They went back and forth, a familiar, ugly tennis match of his cold, corporate logic versus her weaponized sentimentality. Amelia stayed silent, a ghost on the line, until they both, inevitably, turned on her. "Amelia, tell him he's being a monster," Sarah pleaded. "Amelia, for God's sake, talk some sense into your sister," Richard demanded. "Maybe," Amelia offered, her voice small, a fragile attempt at peace, "maybe we could rent it out for a year? Give us some time to think." "No!" they both shouted in unison. "The market could crash by then," Richard said. "I'm not having strangers living in Mom's house," Sarah wailed. The call ended, as it always did, with no resolution, just 2 more layers of resentment added to the pile. Amelia was left in the ringing silence of the living room, the porcelain bird still clutched in her hand, feeling less like a daughter and more like a beleaguered hostage negotiator in a war where both sides wanted to shoot the messenger. She met with Elias, the estate lawyer, the next day. His calm, orderly office was a welcome refuge from the emotional chaos of the house. Elias had been a friend in college, and his patient, logical demeanor was a comfort. "I don't know what to do," Amelia confessed after recounting the latest battle. "As the executor, I'm supposed to be managing the estate, but I feel like I'm just a referee in their endless personal war. Is there any legal way to break the stalemate?" Elias gave her a sympathetic look and slid a document across his desk. It was their mother's will. He pointed to a single, devastatingly simple clause. And the remainder of my estate, including the property at 123 Oak Street, shall be divided equally among my beloved children, Richard, Sarah, and Amelia." "Your mother's intentions were good, Amelia," Elias said gently. "She wanted to be fair, but in being fair, she was vague." He leaned forward. "Legally, divided equally means you each own an undivided 1/3 interest in the property. No one has a greater claim than anyone else. Richard can't force a sale without a court order, and Sarah can't legally move in without the consent of the other two owners." "So we're stuck," Amelia said, the word a heavy weight. "You're stuck," Elias confirmed. "If you three can't come to a unanimous agreement, the only legal remedy is for one of them to file a partition lawsuit. A judge would then order the property to be sold and the proceeds split. It's the ugliest, most expensive, and most surefire way to destroy what's left of a family. And right now, that's where you're headed." The lawyer's words confirmed her deepest fear. The ambiguity of the will was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a bomb waiting to go off, and she was the one who had been left to try and disarm it. That evening, Amelia returned to the house on Oak Street. It no longer felt like a place of comfort or memory. It was a battleground. It was an asset. It was a legal problem. She sank into her mother's favorite armchair, the worn floral fabric soft beneath her fingers. The silence of the house pressed in on her. It was a silence filled with the angry, shouting ghosts of her siblings and the quiet, disappointed ghost of her mother's good intentions. Her life, for the foreseeable future, was no longer her own. Her job at the museum, her friends, her own small apartment, they all felt a million miles away. Her new, unpaid, and unwanted full-time job was to be the warden of this disputed territory, the keeper of a house that was no longer a home. She was the youngest, the quiet one, the one who had always smoothed things over, and she had been left with a silent burden, a problem so vast and so toxic, she had no idea how she would ever solve it. She closed her eyes and felt the four walls of the house she had once loved closing in around her. The weeks following the initial skirmish were a slow, grinding escalation of a Cold War. The family home, once a place of comfort, became a contested territory, and Amelia's phone became the battlefield. Richard, accustomed to the swift, hostile takeovers of the corporate world, grew increasingly impatient. He began sending aggressive group texts, attaching links to real estate listings for comparable properties in the neighborhood with messages like, "This one just sold for $1.2 million. We are losing money every day this circus continues." Sarah, in turn, escalated her campaign of emotional warfare. She would leave long, tearful voicemails for Amelia, accusing her of siding with Richard, of not honoring their mother's energy, and of being cold and unfeeling. She began sending Amelia unsolicited design ideas for her new studio in the sunroom, a passive-aggressive act of claiming territory that wasn't hers. Amelia was caught in the crossfire, her own grief held hostage by their competing brands of selfishness. Her dream, a quiet, peaceful life where she could focus on her work and heal from her loss, seemed to drift further away with each angry text and tearful phone call. The conflict reached its ugly public climax on a bright Saturday afternoon. Amelia had arranged for them to meet at the house to begin the difficult task of sorting through their mother's personal belongings. It was meant to be a quiet, collaborative first step. It devolved into a war before they even got through the front door. Richard arrived with a real estate agent in tow, a sleek, predatory-looking woman in a sharp suit who immediately began assessing the house's curb appeal with a critical eye. "What is she doing here?" Sarah shrieked the moment she pulled up and saw the agent, her voice carrying across the quiet suburban street. "She's here to give us a professional market appraisal, Sarah," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's called being a responsible adult." "You're not selling my home," Sarah cried, her face crumpling into a mask of theatrical grief. She pointed a trembling finger at the large oak tree in the front yard. "Dad and I planted that tree. It has our memories in its roots. You can't put a price on that." "Actually," the agent chimed in, with a cold, professional smile, "a mature oak tree like that can add up to 10% to the property value." The comment sent Sarah into a full-blown meltdown. Their argument spilled out onto the front lawn, a shouting match of his cold financial logic versus her overwrought sentimentality. Neighbors, out for afternoon walks or tending to their gardens, began to slow down, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pity. Mrs. Gable from next door caught Amelia's eye from her porch and gave a small, sad shake of her head. This was the last draw, the utter, profound humiliation of it. Her siblings, in their selfish, petty war, had taken their private grief and greed and had turned it into a public spectacle, a piece of street theater for the whole neighborhood to witness. The house was no longer a home or even an asset. It was a circus, and she was the unwilling ringmaster. Something inside Amelia, the part of her that had always tried to smooth things over, to find the compromise, to keep the peace, finally went quiet. It was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She could not manage their emotions. She could not fix their broken relationship. And she was done trying. She stepped between them, her face a mask of calm, quiet fury. "Stop," she said. The single word, spoken without her usual hesitant tone, was so unexpected it actually silenced them. "Both of you go home," she continued, her voice even and low. "This is over for today." "But the appraisal," Richard started. "We are not having an appraisal today," she said, her gaze unwavering. "The meeting is over. Go home." She turned and walked back into the house, closing the heavy front door on their stunned, angry faces. The silence inside was a profound relief. That evening, Amelia sat in Elias's office, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. "I can't do it anymore, Elias," she said, her voice hollow. "I can't be the referee. They're going to destroy each other, and they're going to destroy me in the process." Elias listened, his expression calm and thoughtful. "Then stop trying to referee their emotions, Amelia," he said gently. "You are the executor. You can control the process. You can impose order." "How?" she asked, a note of desperation in her voice. "You're a curator," he said, a small smile on his face. "You're a professional organizer of chaotic things. So do your job. Right now, they're fighting over a ghost, an idea of what the house is worth. You need to give them facts. You need to give them a catalog." He leaned forward. "As the executor, you have the legal authority to halt all discussion of the disposition of assets until a full and complete inventory of the estate has been performed. You tell them that. You tell them that until you have a professionally documented list of every single item in that house and its appraised value, from the grand piano down to the last teaspoon, there is nothing to discuss." The idea was a revelation. It was a move that was both legally sound and perfectly suited to her own unique skills. She couldn't control their greed or their histrionics, but she could control the data. She could impose the quiet, methodical, and unassailable logic of the archive onto their emotional chaos. It was her smart legal action in motion, an act of self-protection disguised as bureaucratic duty. She called the final family meeting of the week that Sunday. Richard and Sarah arrived, still fuming from their lawn confrontation, armed for another battle. But Amelia gave them no battle to fight. "This is not a discussion," she began, her voice cool and formal, cutting them off before they could begin. "This is a notification. As the executor of the estate, I am informing you both that all negotiations regarding the division of assets are hereby suspended. I will be undertaking a complete professional inventory and appraisal of the entire contents of the house and all other properties. This is a necessary legal step to accurately determine the total value of the estate. She looked at them, her expression unreadable. When I am finished, and only when I am finished, we will reconvene to discuss the next steps. Until then, there is nothing more to say. They were stunned into silence. They wanted to argue. She could see it in their faces, but they couldn't. Her move was so procedural, so eminently reasonable, that to object would make them look like petulant children. Annoyed, but legally outmaneuvered, they were forced to agree. The following Saturday, Amelia walked into the quiet, dusty attic of the house on Oak Street. It was a room filled with the chaotic, unsorted memories of a lifetime. Boxes of old letters, trunks of forgotten photographs, stacks of her father's old journals. It was an archivist's nightmare and an overwhelming, emotional minefield. But as she stood there, a sense of calm settled over her. This was her territory. Here, she was not the weak, overlooked younger sister. She was a professional. She put on a pair of white cotton archivist's gloves. She set up a folding table and a good, strong light. She opened the first dusty box. The task was monumental. It would take weeks, maybe months. But for the first time since her mother's death, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost for good, a sense of purpose and a sense of control. She was no longer just sorting through the past. She was searching for a future. The attic was a silent, forgotten kingdom of dust and memories. For weeks, it became Amelia's world. She approached the monumental task not as a daughter cleaning out a house, but as a curator processing a new, deeply personal collection. She set up a work table with good lighting, her laptop, and a digital camera. With the meticulous patience of her profession, she began. Each day was a slow, deliberate dive into the geology of her own family. She photographed and cataloged furniture, china, and art. But her true focus was on the boxes of papers, the raw, unfiltered data of her parents' lives. It was an emotionally grueling excavation. The fragmentation began in the letters. Reading through her mother's correspondence, she saw her siblings through a new, heartbreakingly clear lens. She read letters from her mother to a friend complaining about a teenage Richard's arrogance and his obsession with money. She found a diary entry from her father describing a 20-something Sarah's talent for turning any situation into a 5-act drama about herself. And she saw herself, a quiet ghost in the margins of their story. Amelia is such a good, quiet girl, her mother had written, never a moment's trouble. She was the path of least resistance, the child who had learned early on that her own needs were secondary to the loud, demanding needs of her older siblings. The process of sorting through the past confirmed a painful truth. The toxic dynamic that was tearing them apart now wasn't new. It was ancient, foundational, a rot that had set in long ago. The idealized family she was grieving for, she realized with a profound sadness, had never really existed. She hit rock bottom on a rainy Tuesday, deep into the 3rd week of her work. She was in her father's old study, surrounded by piles of sorted and unsorted history, when the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was the sole sober adult in a family of emotional drunks. The inventory, the facts, the logic, none of it would matter. Richard and Sarah would never agree. They would drain the estate with legal fees, destroy their parents' legacy, and leave her, the quiet peacemaker, standing in the rubble. The task felt utterly, completely hopeless. Pushing through the wave of despair, she turned to the last, most intimidating corner of the study, her father's old metal lockbox. It held the things he had deemed most important: his honorable discharge papers from the Army, a few war medals, the original paid-off deed to the house, and his and her mother's marriage certificate. It felt like the final, sentimental archive of a good man's life. She lifted the heavy lid. The familiar scent of old paper and cedar filled the air. She carefully lifted out the folded flag from his military funeral, the crisp linen of his discharge papers, the heavy bronze of his medals. And there, at the very bottom, was something she had never seen before, a thick, cream-colored manila envelope, its flap sealed with a crumbling wax seal she didn't recognize. It looked official, important. On the front, in her father's neat, strong handwriting, were the words, "To be opened by the executor of my estate, upon my death and the death of my wife." Her heart began a slow, heavy pounding in her chest. This was meant for her. This was a final, hidden instruction. Her hands trembled as she carefully broke the old seal. Inside was not a legal document from a lawyer, but a long, multi-page letter, handwritten on heavy stationery. A notary seal was embossed on the bottom of the final page, dated 20 years ago. She unfolded the pages and began to read. It was her father's voice, clear and strong, reaching out to her across the years. "My dearest Amelia," it began, "if you are reading this, then your mother and I are both gone, and you have been left with the difficult task of settling our affairs. I am writing this letter because there is a piece of my life, a debt of honor, that I was never strong enough to speak of, but which I must ask you, my most steadfast child, to settle on my behalf." The awakening started then, a slow dawning right in the dusty, grief-filled room. "As you know," the letter continued, "I served in the war. What I have never told you is that on my final tour, my life was saved by my best friend, a man named David Vance. He pulled me from a burning vehicle, and in doing so, he took the shrapnel that was meant for me. He died in my arms. His daughter, Eleanor, had just been born. As he lay dying, I made him a promise. I swore to him that I would always look after her, that his child would never be without a safe harbor as long as I was alive." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Vance, a name she had never heard. "Your mother and I helped where we could over the years, but I always felt the weight of that promise, a debt I could never truly repay. David saved my future, and in doing so, he gave me all of you. This house, the life we built here, it was all on borrowed time, bought with his sacrifice. It is time to pay that debt in full. It is my final wish and my most solemn direction that, upon your mother's passing, our home at 123 Oak Street be offered to David's daughter, Eleanor Vance, for the symbolic sum of $1,000. It is not a gift, it is a repayment. I know this will be difficult. I know Richard and Sarah will not understand. Their minds are on the market, on the value of things. But you, my dear Amelia, you have always understood the value of a promise. Please, do this for me. It is the last and most important thing I will ever ask of you." Amelia read the letter a second time, and then a third, the words blurring through her tears. The implications were staggering. Her siblings' petty, vicious fight over the house, his greed, her entitlement, it was all a meaningless farce. The house was never theirs to fight over. It had been promised away decades ago, a sacred payment for a debt of honor she never knew existed. Her father wasn't weak or vague. He had a secret, profound integrity she had never imagined. And her role, she now understood, was not to be a mediator between her warring siblings. It was to be the executor of her father's true, hidden will. She sat in the dusty silence of the study, the letter clutched in her hand. It was not a legal document, she knew, but it was a moral bombshell. Her grief for her father was transformed into a deep, aching respect. Her frustration with her siblings hardened into a cold, clear resolve. She finally understood the story, and she knew what she had to do next. The morning after discovering the letter, Amelia was a changed woman. The weary, grieving daughter who had been buffeted by the whims of her siblings was gone. In her place was a curator who had just acquired a priceless, historically significant artifact. The letter was not just a source of her own empowerment, it was a piece of her father's history, a testament to a code of honor she had never known he possessed. It was a story that deserved to be told correctly. Her first call was to Elias. She read the letter to him over the phone, her voice clear and steady. The lawyer was silent for a long moment after she finished. "Wow," he said finally, the single word filled with a sober respect. "Amelia, that's incredible." "But is it legal?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Does it mean anything against the will?" "Legally, a letter of intent like this isn't as binding as a will," Elias explained carefully. "He can't use it to bequeath property. However," he continued, his voice taking on a new, strategic edge, "in a partition lawsuit, which is what Richard is threatening, the case is decided by a judge in a court of equity. They don't just look at the law, they look at what is fair and just. A document like this, notarized, showing your father's clear, consistent, and long-held intent, motivated by a profound debt of honor from the war, it would be catastrophic to your siblings' case. It guts their entire argument that your mother's will should be the final word. No judge would look kindly on their petty squabbling after reading this. This letter is tactical dynamite." Armed with this knowledge, Amelia felt a new, unshakable confidence settle over her. She now had a purpose that transcended the family squabble. Her duty was no longer to mediate between Richard and Sarah, but to honor her father. The distant war continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Her siblings, unaware of the bombshell she now held, saw her continued silence as stubbornness and escalated their attacks. Richard sent a formal, aggressive email through his own lawyer, demanding a progress report on the inventory and a timeline for the sale. Sarah left a long, rambling voicemail, her voice a saccharine-sweet mixture of manipulation and threat. "Amelia, I'm trying to be patient, but this is getting ridiculous. I'm starting to think you're deliberately stalling. If you're not going to be reasonable, I'll have no choice but to start moving my things into the house. I have a right to be there." Before, these messages would have sent her into a spiral of anxiety. Now, they felt like the buzzing of distant, annoying flies. She was no longer a participant in their small, selfish drama. She was the keeper of a much larger, more important story. She replied to both of them, and their lawyers, with a single, calm, and formal email, a masterpiece of procedural stonewalling that she and Elias had drafted together. "To whom it may concern. As per my duties as executor, the inventory of the estate is a complex and ongoing process. It requires a meticulous review of all assets, including personal papers and effects, to ensure a full and accurate accounting. There is nothing further to discuss regarding the disposition of the property until this work is complete. I will inform all parties when a new meeting is scheduled. Thank you for your patience. Sincerely, Amelia." It was a perfect, unbreachable wall. It was not emotional, it was procedural. It shut them down completely, leaving them frustrated and with no legal recourse. She had taken control of the timeline, and with it, the entire conflict. With her siblings held at bay, Amelia turned her full attention to her new, secret mission, finding Eleanor Vance. She retreated to the place she was most comfortable, the archive. Using her professional access to the university's databases, she began her hunt. She started with her father's military records, cross-referencing his unit with his friend's name. She found him, Private David Vance, killed in action. She found his date of birth and his hometown. From there, she dove into a rabbit hole of public records, online ancestry databases, and digitized newspaper archives. It was a slow, painstaking process, a hunt for a ghost through the faded ink of the past. She hit dead ends. She found marriage certificates and old addresses, but the trail always went cold. For 2 weeks, she worked late into the night, her obsession fueled by a sense of profound duty to her father and to the man who had saved his life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. She was sorting through a box of her mother's old unlabeled photographs and found a Christmas card from 1985. It was from a woman named Helen Vance, David's widow. The card included a small, school picture-sized photo of a smiling teenage girl, Eleanor. The back of the card had a return address in Oak Haven, a quiet town 2 counties over. A final, desperate search in the modern online white pages for that area yielded a single result for an E. Vance at an address in a modest-looking apartment complex. Her heart pounding, she knew she had found her. The next Saturday, Amelia drove to Oak Haven. The apartment complex was clean and quiet, surrounded by well-tended flower beds. She stood outside the door of apartment 2B, her father's letter clutched in her hand, and felt a wave of nervous energy. She knocked. The door opened, and a woman with kind, intelligent, clear blue eyes and a cloud of soft white hair stood before her. She was older, but she was unmistakably the girl from the Christmas card photo. "Yes?" the woman asked, her voice gentle. "Are you Eleanor Vance?" Lena asked, her own voice trembling slightly. The woman's expression shifted, a look of cautious recognition in her eyes. "I am." "My name is Amelia," she said. "My father was Robert Carter. He was a friend of your father's, from the war." Eleanor's reaction was immediate and profound. Her polite smile dissolved, and her eyes filled with a deep, sad warmth. "Robert," she whispered, the name an old, familiar memory. "Of course. Please, dear, come in." Amelia sat in the small, tidy living room, surrounded by books and photographs. With her heart in her throat, she explained why she was there. She told Eleanor about her father's passing, about the discovery of the letter. Then, her voice shaking with emotion, she read her father's words aloud. Eleanor Vance listened, tears streaming silently down her face. When Amelia was finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment, simply nodding, as if confirming a story she had known her whole life. "He was a good man, your father," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "A man of his word." She stood up and walked to a small antique writing desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and removed an old, worn leather box. From it, she pulled out a faded, folded letter of her own. "My father wrote this to my mother, his last letter home," Eleanor said, her hands trembling as she passed the fragile paper to Amelia. "He told her about his best friend, Robert, and he told her about the promise Robert had made to him." Amelia carefully unfolded the letter. The ink was faded, the handwriting that of a young soldier, but the words were clear. "And if anything happens to me, tell Ellie not to worry. My friend Rob has sworn to me he will always make sure she has a safe place to land. He is a man of honor. He will not break his word." The truth, now held in both their hands, was absolute. A sacred trust, passed down through a generation of silence. Amelia was no longer just holding her father's wish. She was holding a promise made between 2 brave young men half a century ago. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it was a promise she had to keep. The final family meeting was not a negotiation. It was a pronouncement. Amelia had Elias arrange it, drafting a formal, final email to Richard and Sarah. A meeting to discuss the final disposition of the property at 123 Oak Street will be held at the house this Saturday at 2 p.m. Our legal counsel, Elias Thorne, will be present. Your attendance is required. The tone was not that of a sibling, but of an executor, and it left no room for argument. They arrived separately, armed for their final battle. Richard came with a leather briefcase containing, Amelia presumed, his latest market analysis and a formal offer to buy out Sarah's share. Sarah arrived with a large, dramatic portfolio of her own, likely filled with sketches of her vision for the house's transformation into her personal art studio. They took their seats on opposite ends of the long living room sofa, a physical manifestation of their fractured relationship. The green and blue sticky notes still dotted the room, sad, colorful little flags from a petty, forgotten war. Amelia and Elias sat opposite them. She was in complete control, a curator about to present the definitive story of the collection. "Thank you both for coming," Amelia began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the thick, hostile silence. "I know you both have final proposals you'd like to present regarding the house." As expected, they launched into their final, impassioned arguments. Richard spoke of investment yields and property taxes. Sarah spoke of spiritual energy and creative legacies. They were not speaking to each other, but at Amelia, the final arbiter of their selfish desires. She listened patiently, without interruption. When they had both finished, the room fell quiet, expectant. They stared at her, waiting for her to choose, to finally pick a side and end the stalemate. "Thank you both for sharing your positions," she said, her voice even, "but it appears you have been arguing over an asset that was never truly yours to divide." Richard scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Amelia. The will is perfectly clear. It's a three-way split." "The will," Amelia said, looking at him with a deep, sad clarity, "was not our mother's final word on the matter. As it turns out, our father had the final word, and he spoke it over 20 years ago." She opened the simple manila folder on her lap. She did not summarize. She did not paraphrase. She simply stood up and, with the clear, steady voice of a historian, she read their father's letter aloud. She read of the war, of the fire, of a young man named David Vance who had given his life to save his friend. She read of the promise made to a dying soldier, a solemn vow to look after his infant daughter. Her father's words, filled with a quiet, profound integrity she had never fully appreciated, filled the room, silencing the petty ghosts of their greed. Quote, "This house, the life we built here, it was all on borrowed time, bought with his sacrifice. It is time to pay that debt in full. It is my final wish and my most solemn direction that, upon your mother's passing, our home at 123 Oak Street be offered to David's daughter, Eleanor Vance, for the symbolic sum of $1,000. It is not a gift, it is a repayment." When she finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence of profound, devastating shame. Richard sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the numbers and figures of his market analysis now seeming like a foreign, meaningless language. Sarah was staring at her hands, her face pale. The romantic, self-serving narrative of her spiritual connection to the house utterly obliterated. Their bitter, ugly dispute, the fight that had consumed their family for months, had been rendered completely and utterly trivial in the face of their father's secret, lifelong debt of honor. They had no argument left. They had no moral ground left to stand on. Amelia placed the letter back in its folder. "As executor," she said, her voice now holding the full weight of her authority, "my duty is not to our wants, but to our father's final wish. I have verified this story. I have met with Eleanor Vance, and I will be honoring his promise. The house will be offered to her, as he intended. The remaining assets will be divided as per the will, but the house is no longer a part of this discussion." Defeated, exposed, and diminished, they could only nod in stunned, resentful silence. The meeting was over. Amelia watched as they gathered their things, their briefcases and portfolios now filled with useless, irrelevant plans, and left the house. She closed the door behind them. The quiet, final click of the latch, the sound of a long, painful chapter of her life finally coming to an end. Epilogue. 6 months later. The local history museum was buzzing with the quiet, respectful energy of an opening night. The new main exhibit, which had been Amelia's passion project for the past few months, was a resounding success. The house on Oak Street now had a new happy life. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had spent her life in modest apartments, had accepted the offer with tears of disbelief and gratitude. She had moved in, and the house was once again filled with the scent of baking and the sound of grandchildren's laughter. The remaining, less contentious assets of the estate had been quietly and quickly divided. Amelia had not spoken to her siblings since that final day, and a profound healing peace had settled over her own life. She stood near the entrance of the new exhibit she had curated. The title, in elegant vinyl lettering on the wall, read, "A Debt of Honor: Stories of Service and Sacrifice from Our Community's Varens." In a central glass case, under a soft, warm light, was a display dedicated to her father. It held his medals, a photograph of him as a young soldier with his best friend David Vance, and a carefully reproduced archival copy of his letter. Elias and her friends from the museum were there, congratulating her. She felt a deep sense of peace, of a purpose fulfilled. She had not just settled an estate, she had curated her own family's history, choosing to amplify the part of it that was noble, honorable, and true. Later, after the last of the guests had departed, she walked through the quiet, darkened museum. She paused in front of her father's display. She had honored his story. She had honored his promise, and in doing so, she had finally been freed from the burden of her siblings' drama. Her own life was quiet, it was orderly, and for the first time, it was completely her own.